Every year, thousands of Americans lose their lives to gun violence. How has this issue affected our city, and what is our community doing to reduce gun violence? Plus, actions locals are taking to keep our schools safe. I'm Rana Kamal. This is Our Issues, Twin Cities. A promising initiative in Minneapolis offers after-school and weekend programs to keep youth off the streets and away from violence.
We all have one mission, is to prevent youth violence.
For Solden, being around violence as a young kid made him grow up fast. Today, he's a voice for youth violence prevention. How has violence in our city impacted youth?
That's the most impact in the communities, is the violence. The community that I grew up in, North Minneapolis, it's a lot of violence. I think that's the majority of anything that goes on is violence. It's all you see. And it has an effect on the way you grow up, the way you sleep, the way you eat.
We really try to think about violence as an epidemic, knowing that it spreads and that exposure is the most important factor that we need to control.
Sasha is the Youth Violence Prevention Coordinator of Blueprint for Action, a public health approach launched by the City of Minneapolis and Hennepin County in 2008 to address young adult and juvenile violence. How critical of an issue is youth violence in our city today?
Prevention is what we can say. We're really looking at strategies to make sure young people are avoiding violence, that they're not being exposed to it very early in life through family or community violence. We're working diligently with our partners and trying to make sure that young people have those safe outlets, that we're providing the programs and the training to make sure that programs are quality programs and can do the work in order to prevent those episodes from happening, but also to be able to intervene when they do, because we know we live in a world where sometimes violence does happen, unfortunately.
In the last 12 to 18 months, violent crime has been upticking ever so slightly. In fact, this last year, violent crime in the county went up about 8% overall. Gun violence plays a big role in that.
Hennepin County Sheriff Rick Stanek began his service to the city of Minneapolis in 1984 as a police officer. In the late 1990s, Stanek worked to reduce one of the most dangerous years in the city of Minneapolis, nicknamed Murderapolis at the time.
As it turns out, at the time, I worked in the Criminal Investigations Division, Homicide Unit, and so I lived it every single day. That year we had nearly 100 murders in the city.
You've said in the past, gun control alone cannot solve the problem of extreme gun violence. What is the solution to solving extreme gun violence across our nation?
You gotta have a partnership with the community, right? I mean, Second Amendment, people have a constitutional right to own and possess firearms. It's just a fact of life. It's the way it's going to be. And so you have to have responsible gun ownership. Responsible gun ownership comes in a lot of different ways, methods, and means.
In Minnesota, gun laws are moderate compared to the rest of the nation. Recently, Minnesota earned a grade of C for the strength of its gun laws as part of the 2015 Gun Law State Scorecard compiled by the California-based Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence.
The state of Minnesota requires that anyone who wants to purchase either a handgun or an assault-style rifle has to get a permit to purchase.
Catherine is the media liaison for the NRA.
Minnesota requires you to get the permit to purchase, which that permit involves going through a federal background check. And then if you want to carry your firearm, you have to get a separate license called a concealed carry license in Minnesota. And to get that concealed carry license, the state requires that you go through training. And that license is good for 5 years.
Although Minnesota ranked 43rd among the states with the highest level of gun deaths, gun violence continues to be an issue in our community, especially among our youth. A few years ago, gun-related assaults were 60% higher among juveniles and 50% higher among 18 to 24-year-olds. What has Blueprint Minneapolis done and is doing to keep guns out of young people's hands?
We are constantly working on the prevention piece, but we are also doing the intervention piece and really looking at those young people who maybe have some risk factors for being involved in violence, or who we know can be great messengers to their peers about why avoiding violence is so important. And so we think getting older youth involved has really made a huge difference, and getting some of the young people who have the vision and voice to be able to reach their peers has been a really important part of it.
Get them involved with something else. There's guns on the streets. They outside all the time. They're gonna find a gun, they're gonna buy a gun. You need to keep them in buildings, keep them in school, study after school programs.
And through his focus to end gun violence in our community since serving as sheriff, Stanek has reduced violence in Hennepin County by 38%. What are you doing today to help solve issues that lead to violence in our city?
Several. One, community outreach, right? Educating the community about the inherent dangers of gun violence, safe gun ownership. Who do they call when they've got an issue or a problem, or their son or daughter, they find a gun in their sock drawer, or somebody says, hey, I'm going to bring a gun to school or work. So often, there are a lot of indicators that happen long before a bad thing happens, but people have to be able to speak up. You have to give them a place or a venue to do that speaking up and then act on it. You have to be able to work with the community and help them understand the different crimes and components that comprise gun violence. It doesn't matter whether it's different neighborhoods that you live in, it doesn't matter whether the type of crime. There's no reason why a young person should be carrying a gun because he or she is afraid for their own safety. That shouldn't happen in this 21st century. Not even close.
When we return, how gun violence has affected our schools across the nation and what our community is doing to keep our students and faculty safe. The troubling history of school shootings across the nation has affected one too many communities, especially in the past 20 years. In Minnesota, 2 students were shot and killed when a freshman entered Ricori High School in Cold Spring in 2003. In 2005, 16-year-old Jeffrey Wise went on a killing spree at his high school of Red Lake Senior High, leaving 7 people dead after murdering his grandfather and his grandfather's girlfriend. What is the solution to keeping our kids safe in schools?
I think the solution with these mass school shootings and others, number one, law enforcement's doing a pretty good job, right? We train, we exercise, we plan incessantly, hoping that this bad thing never happens, but understanding and knowing full well the reality is every single day across this country something like that happens. We've been working intently with the school districts themselves, the teachers, the educators, the superintendents, to put those action plans in place for parents to understand what happens and for them to have those tough conversations with their young people about what happens when something like this happens, or a friend or a relative or a schoolmate says something that isn't right. What can he or she do about it? Everybody plays a role.
I tell all the kids my number one job is to keep them safe. Nice.
As the principal of Ridgeview Elementary in Bloomington for over 20 years, Steve's life is dedicated to the well-being of his school kids.
We practice keeping them safe. It might be practicing how we respond to kids who are making mean comments or being mean, but also when we know that there might be a threat, what we do to keep ourselves safe is really important.
That's the ultimate goal. It all boils down to life safety.
Former police officer and Sergeant Paul works with Bloomington Public Schools in efforts to keep students safe through trainings and lockdown drills. In case of an intruder entering a building, what do the lockdown drills entail?
The lockdown drills entail immediate acknowledgement or awareness that we have a threat in the building. The identification that our safe condition for this building is lockdown, and then automated or a public address announcement to all teaching staff, everyone in the building, that we need to follow our lockdown procedures. Teachers are trained and they know exactly what to do in lockdown. Over the past number of years, the teachers really are rock solid on what they need to do for lockdown. So once the threat is identified and that safe condition occurs, the principal places a school in that condition, they make contact with 911 and they assume command over the radio.
Over the walkie-talkie, I go into my office, I take command so that I can help facilitate the things that are happening throughout the building.
In 1999, armed students Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold entered their school of Columbine High, terrorizing their fellow classmates and teachers, killing 13 and wounding 20.
For my first responsibility getting on scene was to tending to students that had been shot multiple times outside the building, leading kids to safety.
Rick led the crisis team in the Columbine High School tragedy. Today, he's the district's executive director of community relations and emergency management. What are you doing in the community to keep our schools safer in case of a shooting?
You know, in schools we deal with crisis in a given year. It's a wide spectrum. The Newtowns and the Columbine High School situations are on one end, and you know the everyday kind of bumps and bruises a student will have is on the other. But there's a lot in between, and we deal with those. I wouldn't say every day, but probably weekly. There's some kind of incident that we have to deal with. Our urban schools systems deal with it far more frequently than many of our suburban and even rural. But no one is immune. And so it comes down to education, conversations with each other, and really keeping our eyes and ears open to the ground and being there for kids. You know, one of the things that we were criticized at Columbine High School is that the two murderers fell through the cracks, and that there were lots of red flags, there were signs. But the reality is that all of the averted school shootings, those that have not occurred, is when someone came forward, whether it was a student or someone that came forward and told an adult or told police. And by that intervention, that's the only way we've been able to not have more tragedies. You could pick up a newspaper, you could watch TV and hear about these across the country. You don't hear a lot about them because they don't make the headline news, but they occur. And those are the victories. Those are the bright things that we in the education world and emergency management world count our blessings when those happen because they were averted.
The school district performs 5 lockdown drills a year to prepare faculty and students in case of an emergency.
The more we train, the more we drill, the more we prepare students and staff, the more our brain then tends to revert back to that piece that it knows in those high-stress situations.
How important are these lockdown drills, especially today, to keep kids safe?
They're important to practice. First of all, if under any kind of stressful situation, you naturally do what you've practiced. And so we never know when anything stressful is going to happen or anything outside our doors is going to happen. So practicing is really important. It's also important for kids to know and to kind of have deep in their hearts and know that they are safe when they're here at school.
How effective have these lockdown drills been?
I think they've been very effective because we've really focused on the timeliness of implementing the safety plan so that the immediate sense of the threat brings you immediately to decision making of going to that safe condition.
Today, school districts across the U.S. have implemented lockdown drills to ensure the safety of schools. In this day and age, how important is it that all schools across America implement these lockdown drills?
I said on the front side that schools are very safe, and they are. But Sandy Hook happened. Columbine happened. So we need to have a plan ahead of time so that we know what to do. The last thing you want to have happen when a threatening situation occurs is to have to go to a wall and look at a list and say, oh, I have to do this, oh, I have to do this. No, we drill.
When the bad stuff happens, knowing what to do can be the difference between chaos and calm and even life and death. And that's why school districts across the country and states, I believe in almost all states, there's a requirement that they have drills, that they have a plan in place to know what to do.
They're really essential to keep everybody in the building safe, all right? We plan for the worst, hope for the best, all right? And in all likelihood, not anything like what has happened throughout the country that we hear about in the news is going to happen here. But if in fact it might, we want to be ready to handle it in a way that keeps everybody safe.
Up next on Our Issues Twin Cities, keeping our streets safer through the efforts of our community. In the past 12 years, 118 Minnesota youth died from gun violence, all under the age of 18. Declaring gun violence a public health epidemic, Blueprint for Action believes youth violence is both addressable and preventable. Since the plan has launched, have you seen violent crimes among youth decrease?
We've seen a significant decrease since the original implementation of the plan in 2018. And across the country, we saw a small spike in violence, smaller in some places, larger in others, but pretty much every large city had a spike this past summer. And we've been managing a small spike here in the Twin Cities over the last year.
In just the first 2 weeks of July in 2015, there were 26 shootings, with most taking place in North Minneapolis, others in downtown and South Minneapolis. What can the city of Minneapolis be doing to prevent youth from being victims or perpetrators of violence?
If Minneapolis could provide a place where youth in this city to like express themselves in the studio or play basketball or whatever they want to do, I think that'd be a good thing, and it'll stop some of the violence.
We really think that we've got plans and programs in place to help navigate that with young people.
And that is exactly what Blueprint for Action is doing through their array of programs for Minneapolis youth to keep kids and young adults from engaging in violent crimes.
We want to make sure that we get them plugged into resources and programs that can help them turn their lives in a different direction. MLK, where we're at, is one of the sites that we utilize to provide programming for adolescents who are a little bit older, that 14 to 19 age bracket that really needs some pro-social environment to be in. Our Night Owls program is a great program that's run by Minneapolis Parks and Recs, keeping the gyms open later so that young people can come in and play basketball and interact with adults, which we know is so important. That mentorship piece is such an important part of healthy youth development and that avoidance of violence that we look for.
How have the youth responded to these programs?
We've seen overwhelming support, and I think one of the reasons why is because we don't launch them as the city coming down, but we really try to partner with community-based agencies and programs like Parks and Recs in places where kids are already going to be, and really being able to shift gears and not just talk about recreation, but also talk about how recreation is a tool to keeping young people away from violence.
What is the key to ending violence among young people in Minneapolis?
They all have their own individual problems. They all need their own individual help. It's just, they need a building where all of these different foundation organizations, they need to all click up and just come inside and just help that one individual, one person at a time.
Despite the slight increase of gun violence in the past year, Sheriff Stanek says the county is still safe.
Over the last decade or so, you really saw historical drops in terms of violent crime overall.
As you continue to work with Hennepin County to keep our streets safe, what challenges lie ahead for you?
I think a multitude of challenges. Number one, we live in a very diverse community. Hennepin County is about 1.2 million residents spread out over 45 cities with 37 local police departments. About 450,000 of that 1.2 million residents are new immigrant communities, right? A lot of different people. We are a refugee resettlement state. We welcome people in. That's a good thing. We appreciate and celebrate that diversity, but with that comes a basic misunderstanding about what criminal justice is, what is their role in society, whether they assimilate or integrate. Key difference between the two. It's our job to be tolerant and to help them really integrate into the community, understand what their responsibilities are. But you'd be surprised how many times I come across a mom or a dad, a niece, maybe an aunt or an uncle, and they say, I don't understand what this means. I don't understand if you have constitutional rights and you're not guilty of anything until the judge says that you're guilty of something, how you can go to jail for 36 hours or 48 hours, or why are you being held in jail? What does that mean when you change into an orange jumpsuit? What does it mean when you go see the county attorney or a public defender? What's probation? What's parole? They have no basic concept or understanding. Again, For the vast majority of the new immigrants in this community, sometimes they come from places where law enforcement's not the warm and friendly smile like you get from me, where they're more of an oppressive arm of government. That's not like what it is here in the United States or in our community of Hennepin County.
Young people are tomorrow's leaders. They are our future. How important is it to invest in them and keep them off the streets?
You know, young people are the sweat, blood, and tears of the city, and if we don't invest in them and make sure that they're prepared to run Minneapolis in the next 10, 15, 20 plus years, we're going to be in trouble. And so I wake up every morning passionate and committed to making sure that young people like Solden and others are primed and ready to go, and that their experiences are going to lead to them being able to make Minneapolis a bigger and better place to live in the next, decades.
You look at those little faces and you say, come on, this is who we are. We all remember great experiences when we were younger, and there was somebody in our lives who reached out and said a kind word, did a kind deed, maybe provided some support or leadership, and you don't forget people like that. I expect our deputies to be just like that.
Thank you for joining me this week on Our Issues Twin Cities. I'm Rena Kaman. See you next time.